Okay, great. Can you hear me? It seems like the mic is on. My name is Mike Carpenter. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, also senior director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. Welcome to this panel on frozen conflicts and the Kremlin's agenda. We have an all-star cast here. I will begin by introducing our panelists, and then we're going to dive straight into questions from me for about an hour, and then after an hour is up, I will open up the floor to your questions, and you are free to ask the panelists whatever is on your mind for about half an hour, and then we will wrap up and go to lunch. So let me start by introducing our panelists. Furthest to my left is Denis Cenusa. I hope I've got the pronunciation right. He is a researcher at the Institut for Politikwissenschaft at the Justus-Liebig-Universität in Gießen. To his right is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and a research associate at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. In the middle is Ambassador John Herbst, who I think you all know, director of the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan. Seated next to Ambassador Herbst is the Honorable Khidasheli, former Minister of Defense of the Republic of Georgia, as well as a member of Parliament from Georgia. And then seated next to me is Ambassador Jim Warlick, former U.S. co-chair of the OSCE Minsk group for dealing with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and also a former U.S. ambassador to Bulgaria and many other high-profile assignments in the State Department. So the title of this panel is Frozen Conflicts and the Kremlin's Agenda. I will start out by saying that although I'm not fond of diplo-speak, in the State Department, we used to refer to them as protracted conflicts for a reason, because they're not frozen, to put it very simply. And so as we discuss this, I want to sort of start out with that caveat that these are frozen conflicts in quotes, but in fact, if you follow the Donbass, or if you follow what's happening in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, you know that these conflicts are anything but frozen. But they all fall, curiously, along Russia's periphery. And in each one of these conflicts, although the etiology and the course of the conflict is different in each case, in each of these instances, Moscow holds the key to either resolution, the status quo, or a worsening of the situation. And so I think we're going to have an interesting discussion about how they vary, but what also are the common themes. I'd like to start with Ambassador Herbst. So you follow the region. You're familiar with all of these protracted conflicts or frozen conflicts. As I said, they're all very different. But is there an overarching Kremlin agenda that is tied to all of these that is common?
The short answer is yes. A way to describe these circumstances are that the Kremlin has decided to essentially strengthen the claims, bolster the claims of minorities who have grievances in all these countries as an effort to exert pressure on the governments of those countries to move their policies in Moscow's direction. That's the structural core of these circumstances. So the Kremlin has an interest in making sure that there's always conflict, but also trying to keep them under a relative amount of control so it doesn't break out into open war. Although it will accept open war, as we've seen. In fact, Russia will participate, as it did in Georgia in 2008, and as it's doing now in Ukraine, in its effort to project influence. And this is a very important point. These conflicts, this Kremlin policy goes back to the very beginning of the post-Soviet era. And even when you had a President Yeltsin in Moscow, who's pursuing overall policies that from the standpoint of the West made sense, at a minimum, his power ministries were running these frozen conflicts in direct contradiction to the principles that Russia was announcing.
Is there anything specific that Moscow wants in each of these cases, a specific policy outcome, or is it influence and control?
Well, what we've seen in all of these cases, governments interested in, at a minimum, good relations with the West, and in some cases wanting to orient their policies overall with the West. This was clear in Georgia even under Shevardnadze. Azerbaijan always had a Western inclination, at least in terms of national security policy. Its values, that's a different story. In Ukraine, ambivalent but looking west, and then of course, starting with the Orange Revolution, very definitely looking west. And Moldova as well, ambivalence and then increasingly westward orientation. So this is a check from Moscow's point of view, frozen conflicts, on the ability of these countries to move west.
Thanks. Minister Khidasheli, the dominant narrative on the conflicts in Georgia are that Moscow feared encirclement by NATO. Georgia, after the Bucharest summit in particular, was moving closer towards NATO as an alliance. There was discussion of a membership action plan that was hotly contested in that NATO summit. Is this the primary reason why the Kremlin intervened and unfroze these conflicts, so to speak, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia? Or is there something else at work here besides simply NATO enlargement as the driver for the war of 2008?
Well, I fully subscribe to Ambassador Herbst's points that it did not start in 2008, and the goal of Russia was pretty clear already in the 90s during Yeltsin times, when the first war started in Georgia. 91 South Ossetia, 92 Abkhazia. It was pretty clear that with the advance of Baltic states, Russia was making sure that no other republic would have a success on that path of escaping the gray zone, as we say on this conference, and escaping the Russian influence. So 2008 was or let's say after the Rose Revolution, Georgia was successful country. It was moving ahead in a very rapid speed. There were lots of things happening, both in economic development as well as political development in the country. The biggest troubles of Georgia were over: corruption, torture, police brutality, all those things that Rose Revolution happened for. And it was pretty obvious for Russia that there was a reason to be afraid of Georgia actually finding its way and escaping from that gray zone. So they should have stopped us. Bucharest summit obviously was an intriguing factor because it was pretty clear for everybody, but regardless losing that fight in Bucharest and not having Georgia on board, neither as a member nor with the map, the decision that was taken about and the statement that is in Bucharest summit declaration that Georgia will become member of NATO, it was pretty clear that something should have been done pretty soon. So there is we believe in Georgia that there was this 6-month time frame given to Russia to do, if there was anything, any resource they had left to act against Georgia. 6 months from Bucharest to the first defense ministerial, that we've expected another fight being launched, and map finally awarded to Georgia. So the August, the Olympics in Beijing, all those events obviously helped Russia to identify the concrete time frame when the world was not that much paying attention, that much of an attention to the events elsewhere. And we've got engaged into the war in August that unfortunately stopped Georgia's advance for many years. Now we see for 10 years. At that time we were not projecting that long, but it is obviously there that it's going to take much longer to get any concrete results from our Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Then it looked in the beginning of 2008 with President George Bush being completely on board, being personally engaged and investing lots of power, influence and resources in having Georgia on board, especially to NATO, but also in the European Union direction. So yes, I completely agree that it is all about the European Euro-Atlantic integration. It is to stop it, but also it is to stop another aspect probably is that Russia is afraid of a real success story in the countries where it believes it has all the interests and its power vested. And Georgia is one of those problematic places for Russia that the rest of the former Soviet Union republics look after. If it works with Georgia, then there is much more hope that it will work for anybody else. If it will fail in Georgia, then it will be much more difficult to convince the others that there will be another story for those countries.
So let me push you on the NATO aspect. So some argue that if NATO had been off the table completely for Georgia, perhaps the conflict would not have happened, at least not in August of 2008. Others claim that had Georgia received a membership action plan at Bucharest, there wouldn't have been a war in August. Do you subscribe to either of those views?
I subscribe to the second one. I do agree that if there was a map to Georgia and very clear decision from the NATO that it is already on and that the agenda is here and this is the time frame, and it's going to happen, it's unavoidable. So now, yes, literally speaking, it's not Article 5 if you have map, but the commitment is there, then I believe that August 2008 was easy to avoid. On the other hand, I don't believe, as I've already said, it is only about NATO and it is only about the European Union. It's about overall success. Even if Georgia was a neutral state, but successful, economically, politically, real democracy, it is problematic for Russia. It is problematic because it narrows the gray zone. It narrows this cycle around Russia of non-democracies, failed states, easy to manipulate, pessimism that is unfortunately growing now in Georgia. Any success in my country, or in Ukraine, or in Moldova for that matter, or in Armenia now, regardless of whatever Armenia's geopolitical orientation and tomorrow's foreign policy addresses, it is a huge problem for Russia. Because once again, what they are afraid of most of all, yes, it is moving borders of NATO closer to Russia, but even more moving freedom borders and development and success borders closer to Russia. Because it's not just only about Central Asia or Azerbaijan or Armenia, it is about Russia itself. It is a very inspiring moment. Rose Revolution, Orange Revolution, even the revolution in Kyrgyzstan at that time, Arab Spring. This is problematic for Russia itself, not only because of its neighborhood, but for its own society. So I disagree that it is only about NATO. NATO played a big portion. Our NATO ambition is kind of easy target for Russians in this regard, but it is more about not allowing success in its neighborhood.
Okay, great. We're going to get more into this in the case of Moldova, which is constitutionally neutral, but where there's a Russian presence in a frozen conflict as well. But first, I'd like to turn to Maria. Maria, Russia is excellent at the use of proxies. This is one of its most incredible diplomatic skills. And sometimes military skills as well, is harnessing proxies to achieve its aim and hiding behind them. In each of these conflicts, there are nominally two parties to the conflict. And yet, Moscow positions itself as either the mediator or the peacekeeper. Sometimes it has peacekeepers in the region where the conflict is taking place. Although all of these regions are different, to what extent does Moscow really call the shots in these places where there are frozen conflicts?
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I wanted to point out that I definitely agree with our esteemed participants about the role Moscow played in all of these conflicts. Why I disagree is to the extent to which Moscow always had the same goals and purposes in all these conflicts, right? If you look at what happened in early 1990s, it seems that the strategy was less shaped by a specific desire to avoid further European integration of those republics, precisely because at the moment, just a reminder, Russia was actually quite interested to continue the European integration itself. It seems that the strategy has been really changing during the rule of Putin. And here we see really a very different stances that Moscow's taken and the learning curve, so to speak. So first of all, in some of the cases, the conflict is really driven by some pre-existing ethnic tensions. We know, right? Some of the conflicts date back to the 1989, 1988 period. And in those cases, it seems that Moscow seems to be playing less the role of a creator of the conflict per se, as much as it does a mediator who is also making sure that the conflict persists in a frozen shape. That's why, because as it has been mentioned before, that's the leverage. That's how Moscow ensures it's still a powerful player in that conflict. Now, what you can also look at in order to determine the extent, the degree of Moscow's influence in those conflicts are a bunch of intermediating factors. So, for example, does Moscow has a military presence in the region? Is it allowed the military base? What is the extent of the economic penetration? And this one is really important. I would actually encourage you to look at the local currency. Does those regions actually even have one? So you see that in case of Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, they insist on using their own currency, which also suggests that the economic penetration of Moscow is not as strong, as opposed to other regions such as South Ossetia or DNR, LNR. They're really using ruble and they're not really hiding it. Other factors include the degree of penetration connections with the Russian economy. Again, it's a very serious factor, and the stronger it is, the more we're likely to say that the conflict is totally controlled by the Moscow side. And one more point that I wanted to mention in terms of the learning curve is that it seems that Moscow is kind of learning some lessons from the experience in Georgia, and the acknowledging the independence of the self-proclaimed republic didn't really serve the purpose as well in terms of maintaining the leverage over Georgia. That's why in case of Ukraine, the strategy is more subtle, trying to insist on perhaps the so-called reintegration of the republics back into the region, which will into the country, which would also allow to preserve the leverage in terms of diplomacy, in terms of achieving all these goals that were previously mentioned. So to sum it up, even if certainly in all those frozen conflicts cases, Moscow does play a very substantive role, the degree of impact does really differs depending on when the conflict started, what were the real reasons for underlying the conflict, and how it continued. So we certainly will see Kremlin attempting to use a similar strategy in the future. A lot of talk, I actually just got back from Moscow, a lot of talk continues with regards to Belarus and attempting to create something similar in that region.
Hold that thought, because we're going to get back to this
So
topic.
and we'll get back
That's
to
an
that
interesting
later.
one. I want to spend a little bit more time on that in a few minutes. Jim, so Maria mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh seems perhaps as if it were sui generis. Certainly Moscow was not involved in the genesis of the conflict. Moscow doesn't have troops, hundreds of troops in Nagorno-Karabakh per se. Of course, they have a base in Gyumri. But what is Moscow's role in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? How do they interact with the other co-chair countries of the Minsk group, which, to remind, include the United States and France? And finally, if there were, and I realize this is a hypothetical question, but if there were an agreement between the two sides, the Karabakhis, the Armenians on the one hand, and the Azeris on the other, to implement a resolution, would Moscow be on board with it? Would it suit their interests?
First of all, I think you're right in breaking out Nagorno-Karabakh as sui generis. It is a little bit different. First of all, you mentioned at the outset that these are not frozen conflicts, and certainly Nagorno-Karabakh is not a frozen conflict. We see on a regular basis casualties happening along the line of contact, and I think that we can expect more casualties in the future before there is a resolution. Second, I would want to distinguish a little bit between Nagorno-Karabakh and the other protracted conflicts. I don't think it is within Moscow's power alone to resolve Nagorno-Karabakh. The others, I think arguably it is within Moscow's ability to bring about a settlement within certain parameters. I think even if Moscow were to decide tomorrow that Nagorno-Karabakh needs to be settled, I don't think it's going to happen that easily. We do have varying degrees of independence and sovereignty among the players in Nagorno-Karabakh. I also want to say, too, that unlike perhaps the other conflicts, and I know this isn't very fashionable to say, but the US and Russia actually have some common interests in Nagorno-Karabakh. I think there is an interest, first and foremost, in Moscow not having an unstable southern border where there is active military engagement. We too, I think, in the interests of Armenia and Azerbaijan and all the advantages peace would bring, we would like to find a settlement. And you know, Mike, the conventional wisdom with Nagorno-Karabakh has been that Moscow really doesn't want a settlement. And there are reasons for that. With respect to Azerbaijan, there is a large and financially beneficial military relationship between Moscow and Baku. And as long as there is conflict, you can expect that there will be continuing weapons sales at full price from Russia to Azerbaijan. Similarly, the argument goes that why should Moscow want a settlement with Armenia when there is in fact some degree of dependency, and not just in terms of providing military equipment to Armenia, but also in other areas such as energy. The conventional wisdom has been, well, let the conflict continue. Not exacerbated, not active war, but what's in it for Russia? The problem with that conventional wisdom, from my point of view, as someone who was a negotiator on this for 3 years, is that it just doesn't bear itself out. In fact, about 2.5 years ago, when hostilities did break out, and certainly more than 100 people were killed in a conflict that lasted over several days. I do believe that we worked, the US government, French, my Russian colleague, we worked together pretty well to come up with a plan and put some ideas on the table that could form the basis for a settlement. Those same ideas are still in play. We can come back and talk about what that might look like, but the kind of settlement that, in fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov has suggested is not so different from the kind of settlement that if we were to sit down and write a peace agreement, we would have.
So let me push you a little bit on this, because the notion that Russia does not want conflict along its southern border appears to be belied by its actions in the Donbass, where Russian regular forces are actively stoking a conflict. So if there were a resolution along the lines, roughly along the lines of the basic principles that have been developed by the co-chairs to the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, that essentially means that Armenia is then free to pursue rapprochement with Turkey. Presumably that would be on the table. And there would be transport between Azerbaijan via Armenia to Turkey and onwards to Europe, which would certainly suit Azerbaijan's economic interests. But is that in Russia's interest in the long term? Is it possible that Russia is being accommodative and cooperative within the Minsk group now, because there is no chance for moving forward given where the parties are, but that Moscow actually doesn't want to see a resolution?
I think you raise a very good point. If peace were to break out, the region would change entirely. And for Armenia and Azerbaijan, definitely for the better. For Armenia, that has seen itself isolated and tied to Moscow, it would be a completely different game. And for Azerbaijan, too, that has spent so much of its precious oil resources on military and defense, those resources could be used elsewhere. The devil is in the details, right? And that's probably why we haven't been able to find a settlement. The broad general parameters of a Nagorno-Karabakh settlement, as you say, the basic principles, and there have been many variations of them, the broad parameters we can agree to. But it remains to be seen where Moscow would be if we get to that point where a peace agreement is on the table and the region changes substantially.
Denis, Moldova, like Nagorno-Karabakh, the Transnistria region, is part of an active settlement process, the 5+2 process. And as part of this process, which has been happening for some time, there was some would say, constructive Russian proposal to resolve the conflict in Moldova. And I'm referring to the Kozak plan proposed by Russian mediator Dmitry Kozak in 2003. Which would have effectively given the Transnistrian side a veto over constitutional changes within Moldova, perhaps on important foreign policy objectives like entry into NATO or the EU. Is that the model for peaceful resolution that Moscow wants to see across the board in all of these conflicts? Is it essentially a Republika Srpska type entity that is able to say no, to veto the overall geopolitical aims of the central government?
Actually, your question includes the answer. You're right. Russia is not going to accept any resolution unless it includes veto power for the most loyal agents they have on the ground. And the regime, the separatist regimes, normally they are loyal and they are supported for this loyalty. Either it can be at the official level, which is very visible when you have different meetings at high level between the leaders of the separatist administrations with Kremlin, or you can have it at the informal level between, let's say, those who are representing the vested interests, different oligarchs, different industries, leaders. The most recent case, which is very much in the attention of Moldovan public opinion, is the idea of producing cryptocurrency in the region, in Transnistrian region, using cheap energy which is produced based on Russian gas, for which the Transnistrian region is not paying, and which increases continuously the debt that Moldova has toward Gazprom, which now reached about $7 billion, which is about 90% of the country GDP. So basically, I think that Russia has different agenda with different groups within the separatist regimes, and that is why I believe that these types of relationships are part of the operational goals of Russia, which are separate and are different from the strategic goals, which in my view are to keep the status quo, which means in case of Moldova to have it neutral in relationship with the military blocs, and obviously it's about NATO, while in case of Georgia it's to keep it away, and Ukraine to keep it away from membership, which happened due to wars. And therefore, I believe that what Moldova is trying to do, but is not, in my view, really succeeding because of the specificity of local factors. And here I will mention the government, which cannot be really trusted partners. and having a ruling party which sometimes use Russia as a gambling card in its relationship with the European Union, for example, or blackmailing the European Union with having a nicer relationship with Moscow, will never be acceptable and will never be seen as a real willingness for solving the conflict, the separatist conflict, which is in a way dependent on what Russia decides to be done at that specific moment. I truly believe that Russia is very adaptable, and it will never use the same pattern. It rather tries to combine different elements, and sometimes, unfortunately, external factors are not the useful one. And here I will remind the presidency of Italy, which unfortunately is seen by some representatives of civil society as a presidency which is rather following the interest of Russia than the national interest of Moldova. And here I will mention those agreements which are right now implemented and are presented as successful policies, which one of them it is about the acceptance of Transnistrian transportation in the international traffic, and others are related to accepting the documents in educational sphere issued by the universities from the Transnistrian region. So somehow it's happening. What we all don't like to see is actually legitimization. Very slow, very hidden way of legitimization of separatist regimes, and I believe that this kind of maybe not pattern, but some aspects are really targeted by Russia for Ukraine, because Georgia is a different story right now. They should follow a different partner, model. But for Ukraine, Transnistrization of Donbas conflict is something that I would predict for the moment.
So, but let me push you on the structural factors here. So, if Russia would be willing to accept a resolution along the lines of the Kozak plan that gives Transnistria effectively a veto, currently they don't trust the authorities in Chisinau, obviously. If they were willing to trust this arrangement, that would suggest that the Transnistrian authorities are pretty close proxies of the Moscow regime. Is that the case?
Yes, and it never changed. I think that what Russia is expecting from Moldova right now is to multiply those loyalists. And while I'm saying about that, I obviously mean the presidency office and the socialist opposition, which is playing the role of friends of Russia. And they already launched different ideas that would accommodate really interest of Russia in the region. One of them is obviously to revise and to revive the idea of federalization of Moldova, which will include also the autonomy, Gagauzia autonomy, where Turkey is interested to have a strong hold, and Erdogan was visiting recently Moldova, and so many things could be told about that, but I will not steal time for that. What is in the view of Russia important is to ensure that what is going on now with the presidency office. The president signed, the proposed to have a memorandum of cooperation with the Eurasian Union, and also he was the one who was pushing for having a status of country observer within the Eurasian Union. So to have the same principle of behavior also within the parliament, where right now a different ruling party, which is run by oligarch but has rather volatile interests, so they are playing with different actors. They are not that visibly pro-Russian, so Russia would like to have this pro-Russian, like really acceptable version of politics, both in Transnistria region and in Chisinau. Then they will really think how to proceed further with their plan to have a Transnistria which will run over Chisinau. And the veto power, I believe that is what they really are looking for.
Okay, we'll come back to this. Tina, I have a couple questions for you, but first I want to ask you sort of a question that I think a lot of people have on their minds when they think about Georgia. Why did Moscow recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia? Why not let this fester as contested regions?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer for me, for sure, because at the end of the day, I don't know what's on the mind in
I'm
Kremlin.
asking you to put yourself in Vladimir Putin's
Right.
mind, which is a scary thing.
Which is
but
scary
maybe you can
and
help us
kind of
out.
difficult for someone like me. But looking at the developments from our perspective, from how we see it in Georgia or how we understood it in Georgia, was twofold probably. First of all, after the August war, they should have done something different. So there was if during the 90s, during the first, second, third, whatever cycles of war we had since 91, if Russia's presence, Russia's role was more or less hidden and it was not so much transparent for the rest of the world, they could always argue that they were not there or they were there as peacekeepers, and that was the only role they've ever played in Georgia conflict. In 2008, situation was completely different. So the world saw through CNN and BBC and all international media actual Russian soldiers fighting on the Georgian soil, and they never denied it as well. So they should have done something different. They could not keep things go business as usual. So I think that was the question they posed for themselves. What is it that will make difference now? And the second point probably was that I always argue that the war in Georgia was not only and exclusively about Georgia, as well as I believe war in Ukraine was not only and exclusively about Ukraine. By those wars and by the troubles Russia is making, they're trying to prove their point, not to Tbilisi and Kiev, but to the rest of the world, to Washington, to Brussels, elsewhere, to say that they are the ones who can keep their promises. They do whatever they stand for, and nobody can stop them, and nobody can prevent them from doing whatever is on their mind. So I think recognition somehow falls within this framework that they should have done something different. So that was the only thing. Actually, my question is more why they did not annex Abkhazia, not that much why they did just recognize Abkhazia. But there is a key, and that will be the end of my answer. Abkhazia, not that much South Ossetia, but Abkhazia, the self-determination or the Abkhaz state idea is very strong in Abkhazia. Russians fought it forever, for all these 20 years, and they actually never succeeded. We've seen something similar to those colored revolutions in Abkhazia as well, in a smaller scale, but it still happened during the presidential elections when Russia did not manage to have their own candidate past this threshold, and but still decided that he should have been the president, and the whole country, the whole Abkhazia was out. In Sukhumi streets were crowded by the people, and they did not allow for Moscow to make decisions for themselves. The dream of Abkhaz independent state is very strong in Abkhazia. So I believe that no annexation, just recognition was kind of paying the tribute to the and keeping loyalty of the Abkhazia. They would not keep Abkhazia as annexed, attached to Russia. It would raise more protest in Abkhazia than loyalty or support toward Russia. So in Kremlin, they know perfectly well what's the dynamic of these conflicts. They know the difference between the two. They cannot sell the story, Abkhaz being Russian nation, right? They cannot sell the story of unification or anything even close to it. So they sort of, by declaring the independence and then spending money and spending interest and spending human capital for having other countries also on board, showed their commitment to Abkhaz long-time dream of having this piece of land as an independent state. I think that was on the mind of Moscow when they were making this decision, and then South Ossetia just followed. So it was not per se decision made for South Ossetia, but it was with understanding of Abkhaz fears and Abkhaz understanding of how things should go. And then they did exactly the same with South Ossetia and did not change the pattern. So it would not really make sense to have different decision about two different
For what it's
places.
worth, when I met in, I believe it was March of 2008, with the de facto foreign minister of Abkhazia, Sergei Shamba, and asked him about what would happen if Russia were to de facto annex the region. We weren't, because of that, this is before the war.
Yep.
And he answered that the Abkhaz would fight the Russians to the death, every single one of them, until there was not one left. And I don't know if that was for show or not, but that illustrates what I took to be a sort of a deep-seated ethno-national consciousness there that Moscow had to contend with. But I want to follow up with you and take this a little bit into the future. So you are where you are. It's 2018. You have these two regions occupied, each one with about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 Russian troops.
We have 24,000 altogether.
24,000 altogether.
Well, at least when I was minister at that time, it was the number. So I don't know.
What should, if you were prime minister, what would you do to reintegrate
Georgia
these
or
regions?
Russia?
Georgian. What would you do? And if you could convince NATO and the EU to help you in any way they could, what would be the things you would ask them for to resolve these frozen conflicts?
Yeah, well, first of all, we agreed they are not frozen. I have a big problem.
I'm using shorthand.
Yes,
Protracted. Let's go back to the Diplo speak. Protracted
word.
conflicts.
Living in Georgia does not make you feel
You're
any
right.
day
They're
of
not
the
frozen.
time that it's
You're right.
frozen. Well, of course, there is no magic formula that today there will be this government in Georgia and then this concrete government will be able to finish it all overnight. It's not going to happen like that. But my answer to this question always is, and has been for all these 20 years, consisted with a couple of very concrete, important steps to be taken by Georgia. First of all, it is to have a Georgia where you want to live. If you have a country where citizens from the rest of Georgia are escaping, where citizens from the rest of Georgia are losing hope, are absolutely skeptical about the future of their own country, then obviously it is very hard to imagine that anybody in Sukhumi or Trinwali will be sewing Georgian flags waiting for the reunification with their motherland. So the number one recipe, obviously, is to have Georgia a country where people actually want to live, where people actually are going to enjoy life, where people see their future. So I'm 45 years old. I have 2 kids. One of them just became a student. And I believe that mothers like me living in Sukhumi have exactly the same dreams as I have. They want their kids to be safe, to have good education, if something happens to be treated in good hospitals, and so on and so forth. Is Georgia obvious choice Abkhaz mother makes if something happens or if those questions arise? Which university they want their kids to go? Is it Tbilisi or is it in Moscow? Where do they want to have where do they see their kids more successful? In Georgia or in Moscow? These are very simple, very human questions that any Georgian government needs to be ready to answer positively before they make any steps for talking to those people and winning the hearts. Because at the end of the day, if we for a second exclude the Russia's role and importance and obviously key role in all of that, it is about hearts and minds of the people who live on the other sides of the administrative border in both places, both in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Number 2, our recipe for the success always was a very simple sentence: let's go to Europe together. I just come from Prague, where I was meeting with journalists from South Ossetia, and all of them had troubles getting visas, for, Schengen visas. All of them are going through this horrible process with Russian passports of proving all the time that they are not whatever are the questions, and that they go to the conference or they go to study or to work or for a good cause. So having Georgia in a situation as we are today, obviously it changes the reality for them. If they were Georgian citizens, they would not go through all that hassle and the trouble. But at this moment, it is very risky for them to make that decision and to get the Georgian passports. Visa-free, obviously, is one of those stones that can be used as a good example of actual deliverables that we are getting out of our long-term European integration aspirations. Visa-free, the CFTA, all the business opportunities that arise in front of the Georgian businesses, using it as an opportunity for getting Abkhaz and Georgians together, getting South Ossetians and Georgians together in various business ventures, and having benefits of European integration felt by all of them. This is obviously another chance for again, winning hearts and minds of the people on the other side of the occupation line. But again, the first condition comes first. Okay, they can visa-free, they can travel visa-free with Georgia, they can benefit business-wise with Georgia, but do they feel safe in Georgia? With the growing extremism in Georgia, growing anti-Muslim, anti-whomever movements in Georgia, this extreme nationalistic, chauvinistic extreme that we've never seen, never ever for these 30 years of independence, obviously I would not expect Abkhaz or South Ossetians feeling safe ever thinking or ever making rose revolution or whatever color revolution in Tkhinvali and Sukhumi with the slogans of unifying with Georgia. So it's a very difficult task, obviously. On top of all of that I said, there is Russia and there are Russian military forces standing, and there are 4 military bases, 2 big, two small in size, built on both territories. And there is this recognition paper out there that Russia will feel as its own pride not to take back. But still, I believe that there is a big job to be done by the Georgian government to win the hearts and minds of those people. So if I am in charge of that country, obviously, it is going to be about democratic, real European Georgia. That is the destination for everybody. Georgians, Abkhaz, Ossetians, whomever, I don't know, Armenians, Azeris, Russians, anybody in the region should be willing to live in that country as an example of success and enjoying the rest of the good things that we have, nature, culture, food, tourism, and everything else that is God-given, and we still have it. Unfortunately, it's not happening. So it's very unrealistic to think that, again, the mother of 2 kids in 45 in Sukhumi will be dreaming about this unification with Georgia.
John, moving to Ukraine, the subject of the negotiations or discussions between Kurt Volker and Vladislav Surkov have centered around a peacekeeping operation for the Donbass. There are some Russian-led peacekeeping operations in some of these conflict regions. For example, in South Ossetia before the war, there was the joint peacekeeping force that included Russians. In Transnistria, there are Russian, quote-unquote, peacekeepers. But if you're talking about a UN or an OSCE peacekeeping presence, you're effectively talking about taking the Russians out, taking away their leverage. So is this realistic to be talking about a peacekeeping operation in the Donbass?
The answer is actually pretty simple. Moscow is not winning in Donbass. Ukraine has fought them to a draw, and the Ukrainian public is behind the government as it fights Kremlin aggression. The Russian public is told by its leadership that their soldiers are not fighting in Ukraine, at least not as official soldiers, they're volunteers. When Moscow realizes that it cannot win in Donbass and it's ready to withdraw, it will accept a peacekeeping operation as a fig leaf for them getting out. A serious peacekeeping operation along the lines discussed by Kurt Volker in his conversations with Surkov, and also by some people in the media. That peacekeeping operation would be robust. It would involve literally tens of thousands of soldiers with heavy weapons. They'd have the ability to enforce a peace, and it would be an automatic process which pulls Russian troops and Russian weapons out of Donbass. Right now, the Kremlin is not interested in such a solution. They don't realize that they cannot win, and they are talking about a peacekeeping force which would protect the OSCE monitors. That's not a serious proposal.
But what is winning for the Kremlin? Are they winning now?
No, the Kremlin's objective by starting a war in Donbass was to put pressure on Kyiv so that the government in Kyiv would pursue a Russian-friendly foreign policy. And that goal is evident in the Kremlin's interpretation of Minsk, an interpretation it shares with no other party to Minsk, including the French and the Germans. I believe that there are people in Moscow, including serious, influential people, who understand they cannot achieve this objective. Sadly, that group does not include the effective ruler of Russia, Mr. Putin. We saw late last fall and over the past winter ideas floating from Russian think tanks which were based upon the notion that perhaps the Kremlin, perhaps Mr. Putin, was willing to actually get out of Donbass. That's when they began to talk about these Russian writers who are within the circle of approved thinkers in Moscow. They talked about serious peacekeeping proposals. But it has been clear since at least, I'd say, February or early March of this year that the Kremlin had put these things on hold. Mr. Putin had put these things on hold. He's waiting, as Kurt said earlier today, for the outcome of the Ukrainian presidential and Rada elections. The presidential elections in March of next year, the Rada elections in the fall. The Kremlin will be disappointed with the results of those elections, and then they'll have to seriously look at the fact that their policies are failing in Ukraine.
Jim, I want to come back to where we left it at the end of our last conversation, which is whether a resolution is in Moscow's interests, and whether, right now it seems to me, that Russia has a very zero-sum view of its relationship with the West. In fact, I would say Russia is engaged in a covert war against the West. Does that need to change? Does Moscow need to have a positive sum view of relations with the Western world for an NK resolution to make sense for Russia? And does that mean that a resolution to NK and any of these other conflicts needs to be embedded in some sort of new European security architecture?
I think that's a lot to ask for. First of all, I should let the audience know that Mike has this very special background in Nagorno-Karabakh because he was a negotiator dating back a few years, so he knows this conflict very well. I would say it's a lot to ask that Nagorno-Karabakh be settled in terms of a more global view of Russia's role in the world. I would think that we could work with Russia in a non-zero-sum game on a path to a settlement. I do believe there's an interest in Moscow in supporting certain confidence-building measures. I believe the United States government needs to engage on that. I would say the last administration began that. I see no evidence in this administration of any interest in Nagorno-Karabakh. In fact, our current representative to the OSCE Minsk group at least deserves to have a personal rank of ambassador, as the other negotiators do. I would like to see the United States, Russia, and to some extent France as well, working collaboratively on things that can be achieved now. Confidence-building measures, people-to-people steps. I do think that there is an opportunity to begin a discussion about what a peacekeeping force would look like in Nagorno-Karabakh. That discussion hasn't taken place yet.
Should it include Russian peacekeepers, by the way?
There is what we call the gentleman's agreement. I don't believe that it has ever been captured in a written document, but the members of the OSCE Minsk group have agreed that there will not be peacekeepers from Minsk group countries or Minsk group negotiating countries or the neighboring countries. So that means Russian peacekeepers would be excluded. That also means that US, French, and other peacekeepers would be included. There was a discussion about a decade or so ago that did talk about what a peacekeeping force would look like. But a decade has passed and that discussion hasn't been picked up again, and I think it's one of the areas where we should be talking.
Denis, coming back to Moldova, you talked a little bit about the current president of Moldova, Mr. Dodon, and the party in power. If we saw in the next parliamentary election in Moldova a pro-Russian coalition come to power, would that give Moscow the comfort to be able to pursue a resolution, confident that its people are in power in Chisinau as well as in Tiraspol? Or do they fear that in the future there will be a pathway towards NATO and the EU, despite Moldova's constitutional neutrality and everything else, that makes them want to keep this conflict active?
What is certainly in the interest of Russia is to keep Moldova away from NATO. So the neutrality status is a priority in my view, and that is why the president of Moldova, Dodon, spoke about having an international sort of agreement between the big powers on that would confirm constitutional provisions on neutrality, though this is somehow unbelievably unconventional thinking, because neutrality should come from the sovereignty of the country, from people, not from outside. But okay, the president believed that this would bring an additional support for having this neutrality status cemented. What is for Russia acceptable, in my view, is to have Moldova being integrated, being attached to an European integration process, but not detaching it from Eurasian Union. So what was started with having Moldova as a country with observer status is exactly what they did with Armenia. Somehow, in my view, they try to repeat the same example, to have an Armenia which has an enhanced cooperation agreement with the European Union, which has a cooperation in different economic fields, and a sort of political dialogue, but it is not away from the core of Russian influence, which is right now in their case it's about custom and it's about trade regimes, and should they do this alone or asking Russia every time they want to negotiate a new trade agreement. So in case of Moldova, it would be the reverse of this example. I'm not sure that it will work, but lately some Russian business faces, people mentioned that they are interested in investing in Moldova because Moldova has an association agreement with the European Union. So basically I see this as a consequence of sanction policy as one of the answers, that being harshly punished through sanctions by European Union, by the US, some businesses are looking for new windows of opportunities through countries like Moldova. I don't think that it will happen in Georgia, but who knows, because Georgia right now is changing its voice with regard to its future relationship with Moscow. And this is basically a huge input from the Ivanishvili team. So they are against NATO, and they will keep being like that, but they are not against European integration. First, because this may benefit some their interests, including businesses. And secondly, because European Union is a very vulnerable project, and they understand that who knows what will happen with the European project in the next 10 years. So there is no sense to be against this, because it's also it's useful for Transnistrian businesses who are selling successfully on the European market, having an access through technical provisions of DCFTA, trade agreement with the European Union. And I mean, why to cut the branch from their foot? So I think that they are very pragmatic, and this is what should be understood by us. They are not always keen for going for risky scenarios. Sometimes they are very pragmatic, and they know exactly what they are seeking and what will lead their project. And in case of Moldova, I'm pretty sure that they understand the dynamics, as in case of Georgia, and they really try to squeeze all the opportunities from what the Western partners are giving to Moldovan authorities.
Okay, I'm going to do two more questions, so get your own questions ready. I'll open it up very soon. But Maria, you mentioned Belarus. So I met with President Lukashenko in March of 2016. He spoke for about 2 hours, slightly over 2 hours, of which an hour was spent discussing the Donbass. What does Mr. Lukashenko fear in Belarus right now, if anything?
Oh yeah, that does not really seem like a big surprise, right? He's really scared of the scenario repeating itself in Belarus, with certain pro-Russia forces suddenly feeling a huge urge to rejoin Russia or to rebel against the current government. So there are several reasons for Lukashenko to be concerned at the moment. I just got back from Moscow yesterday, and a lot of people in Russia are discussing Belarus as a possible scenario. That's because Putin in 2024, as we all know, is approaching the end of his second 2 years term, which means that constitutionally, under the current constitution in Russia, he's not allowed to run again. At the same time, he will try to run because it's hard to imagine Russia without Putin, right? So one possible resolution for this problem, rather than changing constitution directly, which is definitely a possibility, another solution would be reorganizing the states to Russia and Belarus, essentially completing the process of unification between Russia and Belarus that's been ongoing forever, and essentially appointing Putin as the top head of that, whatever the new framework there will be. At the same time, Russia, the Kremlin, also needs Lukashenko as at least some geopolitical victory, because as it has been noticed before, Russia has recently really witnessed a sequence of huge geopolitical failures. Last but not the least being the announcement regarding essentially the separation of the Ukrainian Church from the Moscow Patriarchate, which is really a big blow to Moscow, and we know that from a lot of evidence. Now, Lukashenko certainly knows that this is something that is being discussed. And by the way, that is being discussed. You can track that by the number of mentioning of Belarus in the public sphere in Russia. That's how essentially you know that certain issues are being tested by the Kremlin. Constitution and Belarus are two words that are frequently mentioned at the moment. Now, Lukashenko is certainly very worried. And you can see that historically, Lukashenko has been a very smart and careful politician, I would say. So first of all, he very diplomatically refused to accept all these precedents of frozen conflicts, refused to position himself as a pro-Russian, refused to accept the annexation of Crimea, for example, publicly, and certainly tried to essentially take this intermediate position as a neutral observer. At the same time, Lukashenko recently has been very actively trying to reduce Russia's influence in the country. Those attempts are manifested by, for example, such things as prosecuting the Ruski Mir, the Russian world lovers in Belarus, particularly among the Russian Orthodox Church priests. There are ongoing prosecutions against the priests, Orthodox priests in Belarus. There is an attempt to replace the Russian TV agenda with more Ukrainian entertainment content, which is really interesting. There is a deepening of the relationship with China in both trade and military kind of development. Lukashenko is actively fostering his relationship with China as an attempt to create a certain point of resistance to the Kremlin attempts. There's also an interesting dynamic of deploying the weaponry on the border with Russia, which actually would target Russian regions and not the NATO regions, as you would expect, with Lukashenko being such a big fan of resistance to NATO and the West. So all those signs actually suggest that Lukashenko is really concerned. Essentially, the recent news is the fact that actually Belarus was supposed to have presidential and parliamentary election in 2020. But recently there are increasing indicators that Lukashenko will try to at least separate those two elections and perhaps run one of the elections earlier. That is because he is worried that if both elections were to take place in the same year, it would actually essentially provide Russia more leverage with attempts to influence the elections or somehow otherwise undermine Belarus sovereignty. But I would actually be wary against, pronouncing Kremlin's possible success in an attempt to coordinate, to co-opt Belarus in this fashion. First reason, as I mentioned, Lukashenko is really aware of that, and he is smart, and he's certainly trying to build the resistance to such attempts. Second of all, Belarus is a dictatorship, And somewhat ironically, in this particular case, it can help kind of support back Belarus sovereignty, because it has very strong KGB services, very relatively strong military, as compared, for example, to what Ukraine used to have back in 2014. So it's a possibility for stronger resistance. And last but not the least, it is questionable to what extent Belarus actually has those pro-Russian regions. It actually has a very large share of Russian-speaking population, but the Russian language in Belarus is not related to Russian identity. Those Russian speakers are really Belarusian. And in addition, there's really not a region with a very strong concentration of those ethnically Russian residents. So from that perspective, it's actually all of these factors would make it really tricky for the Kremlin to actually try to repeat something that has been done in Ukraine or Georgia. But there's no question that the Kremlin will certainly keep considering that as a possibility in the near future.
Okay, thank you. My last question goes to John, and it is somewhat provocative. Given all these protracted conflicts on Russia's periphery, does Russia need to worry about protracted conflicts in the future on its own territory?
There's no question that the arguments the Kremlin has used to justify its provocative policy in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, could be applied to Russia itself. And Russia has a whole slew of minorities, geographically concentrated. I mean, everyone knows about Chechnya and Dagestan, for example, Tatarstan. Now, that would be a disaster for Russia, and for that matter, a disaster, I think, for the West. We have no desire to see the disintegration of Russia. I think that there are sober minds in Moscow that understand that its provocative policies and what it calls its near abroad can contribute to its own destabilization. I would hope that would ultimately would be another reason to persuade them to back off in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, and also in its impact on Nagorno-Karabakh. And maybe over time it will. But I want to be clear, I am in no way advocating the disintegration of Russia along the lines that it has pursued the disintegration of some of its neighbors. For my friends in Moscow.
Thank you for adding that, John.
Actually, may I say one other thing?
Yeah, please.
Because this should be understood when we talk about the whole question of Kremlin policies in the region. The apologists for Moscow, and of course the Kremlin itself, says what they do, for example, in Ukraine or in Georgia is a response to NATO appearing on its borders. But let's keep in mind, there was no talk about membership in NATO for any country that used to be part of the Soviet imperialist space, including the Warsaw Pact, when Moscow launched its frozen conflict policies. They began that as soon as Russia appeared, as the Soviet Union disappeared, and talk about NATO enlargement occurred years later. We need to understand that. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. The microphones will be coming around. When you ask your question, please state your name and your affiliation and direct it to one or more of the panelists up here. And we'll start with individual questions and then we'll go into groups. So you, sir, here in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th row.
Thank you very much. Vlad Lupan, former Moldovan ambassador to United Nations and former Transnistrian conflict negotiator. My question goes to Denis Cenusa. About what Ambassador Herbst mentioned, the influence Russia believes it can yield over Moldova and ultimately influence the situation in Ukraine. We have seen recently that the coordinator behind the Moldovan government acquired the major Transnistrian company that essentially controls the government there, the so-called government in Transnistrian separatist region. In our language, that means they were allowed in a Russian-controlled area to take over such a company. Do you have a feeling that ahead of the elections that are coming in Moldova at the beginning of 2009, the current government attempts to toy with Kremlin over the influence in Transnistrian region with the hope it will help them in elections? And is there a danger that it will turn against them in this situation, while Russia, in fact, is mainly interested to create more pressure around Ukraine, through Moldova including, through the control that it can yield on in both Transnistrian region and in Chisinau? Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Vlad, for the question. I believe that Moldovan government is really changing its agenda according to its own interest at home. And I will give you another example. In 2016, we were speaking about restoring. I mean, the government were trying to restore the trade relations with Russia, while in the beginning of 2017, they started a massive anti-Russian rhetoric by their media machinery. So obviously they changed their mind because they understood that they're losing they wanted, first of all, to get closer to European Union, though they were not performing reforms. And secondly, that they were not seeing any good results in the polls, which they are quite frequently following. So in my view, this kind of scenario can happen if they will feel that they lose the control over the most important institutions, which is obviously prosecutor office, anti-corruption center, the majority in the parliament. So once this will happen, they will accept even an agreement with devil, which means have a closer relationship with Russia, which means having a coalition which will be with those socialists or those members of pro-Russian party which are bribed by the Democratic Party, or which are somehow in a concerted way moved towards a coalition, which so far was for pro-European forces. So we will rather have a pro-Russia agenda, which will not exclude, again, an association agreement, which is acceptable for Russia, as I mentioned before, but which will obviously be, in a way, that consensus with Russia, which will make happy all the parties involved. And obviously, this is about maintaining the status quo of the current ruling party, which is also important. And by the way, this somehow I sometimes make the comparison with Georgia and Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is a different story. Country is bigger. The dynamics of the lives and the possibilities of the oligarch groups are different. So they lost a lot of leverages that they had before. But with Georgia, we have many things in common. So this, like playing with Russia, like trying to stage specific political situations that will favor the ruling party, like changing the constitution, looking into the electoral system, trying to oscillate between including Washington, why not, but Brussels and Moscow in first place. So they are really smart, and they don't give up from using external factors for their own interest at home.
Interesting. All right, over here, sir, right there.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Rafolu. I'm an Azeri origin journalist in DC. I thank you all for a very timely event, which happened to be on the very day of Azerbaijan's independence. So today is the 27th anniversary of Azerbaijan. And since independence, Azerbaijan was sort of had one foot in Russia, one foot in Europe. And lately we hear from local analysts that they worry that the Azeri government is trying to move both feet towards Russia, at least militarily. We have armed contract between Baku and Moscow, which makes us scratch our hair. The question is, if Moscow were a peacemaker rather than a troublemaker, as Ambassador Warlick suggested, then why is Russia arming both Azerbaijan and Armenia? The US has a policy that we don't sell arms to any of those sides. So what if one of them decide tomorrow that it's a use or lose moment? And will we hold Russia responsible if that happens? And my second question to all the panelists is that, is there such a thing when it comes to frozen conflicts as a Trump doctrine? And if so, what is it? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Jim.
Sure. Well, I'm not going to defend arms sales to Armenia and Azerbaijan by any country, including Russia. What I would say, though, is that there needs to be an effort, a concerted effort, not only by Russia, to ensure that there is a rough equivalence between the military capabilities of Armenia and Azerbaijan. If there weren't such a rough equivalence, the dangers of war would be high. The dangers are high enough as it is. But if we see an inequality, if we see one side or the other prevailing in terms of military capabilities, there could be the risk that in the event of a political and diplomatic stalemate, one side or the other will take military action. And we should be worried about that. I think even with a rough military balance between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I do believe that the sides could be frustrated in the future and come to a conclusion that there can be no resolution through diplomatic channels. And I think that would be unfortunate not only for those two countries, but for the entire region.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'll see if there's one volunteer to answer the Trump doctrine question amongst our panelists.
I think the answer is no.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. In the back, all the way in the back, left corner.
Hi, good morning. My name is Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst here in Washington. My question is about Moldova. You talked a lot about Transnistria. You haven't mentioned Gagauzia. They had the illegal referendum 4 years ago where they voted in favor of greater Russian integration with Russia. There have been reports that Gagauz people have fought with the separatist forces in Ukraine. So what is Russia's role in Gagauzia these days? And do you think this is a potential frozen conflict in the making? Thank you.
Well, I'm very happy that Moldova is really an issue because I've had the feeling that if, for example, in Europe, the interest for Moldova is really like fading. So because of the quality of governance and of politicians, it's somehow little interest. And I'm happy that in Washington it's a big interest. So my answer would be that Russia always favored this region. It was very visible when they decided to remove some of the sanctions or embargo on foodstuff from Gagauzian autonomy and Transnistrian region. So basically they created a discriminative approach toward those companies coming from Moldova. And it was obvious in order to show that if you will act like Gagauzia, where you had the referendum, which was very pro-Russia, then you'll be welcome on Russian market. So they play with Gagauzia as they do with the Transnistrian region in order to create this competition within Moldovan society and in order to have this like always comparative approach. You know, if you'll behave well, then you will be like Gagauzia, so you'll have a special treatment from us. So in my view, Gagauzia is also seen as one of those loyalist region that Russia tried to multiply within Moldova, and it's all during like few years ago when we had another Moldovan politician. Now he's in Moscow. It's about Renato Osate. So he is afraid that he will be incarcerated by Plahotniuc regime. So he was trying to reproduce something similar in the north of the country, where we also have the municipality of Belz, which is populated by Russian-speaking minority, and it was the same, almost the same approach. So that we will look for special economic ties for this trade companies from this region on Russian market, because the rest of the country is pro-European. So basically, we should learn something from the Russian approach in order to use the same, like maybe the same coin, but in favor of having them in European integration process. Though I'm not always agree with this idea, because sometimes we may fall in the trap of creating stronger regimes. With allowing Transnistrian companies selling on the European market, we give them additional oxygen, and they become stronger. We're giving them the possibility to be on the international traffic. We again contribute to their legitimization. So I think it should be very proportionally applied, this principle, because otherwise we will wake up that the Transnistrian region is stronger as a potential independent statehood than it is Moldova as a recognized by international community country.
Okay, and now that we're down to about 5 minutes, let's take 3 questions, and then we'll see if there's any time after that. So over there on the side, and then this gentleman here, and then the lady in back.
Hi, great conversation. Thanks, Mike. My name's John Capello from FDD. For Maria, really quickly, you talked about Belarus and Lukashenko's concerns and some of the things he's doing to alleviate his concerns. I'm wondering, are there opportunities for the West, for the European Union, for the United States in this situation? Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead and collect 3, and then we'll wrap up after that. So, gentleman over here with the yellow tie.
Hello, my name is Ara Margarian. I'm from the Embassy of Armenia. And I want to ask the question to all speakers. The title of the...
We've got 5 minutes, so can you direct...
The conference is regarding... Yeah, I mean, I'm asking a question to all, but
okay.
You can decide answer it or not. I mean, we're talking about gray zone as if the countries around Russia that is considered as a gray zone, and now we are trying to gain our colors and distinguish ourselves out from this gray zone. But meanwhile, we are labeling also. We have another gray zone within this gray zone, which is exactly the topic that we're addressing at this panel regarding the conflict zones. So how do you think, should we continue while we are trying to gain our colors and our identities, do we still should continue labeling those conflict zones as gray ones, or try to approach differently? Thank you.
Great, and then the lady in the back, second to the back row, second to last.
Hello, I'm Vera Gogoria. I'm from Georgia. I'm a Reagan Fellow here. Thank you for this wonderful panel, and thank you for raising the issue of colors. On that issue, we call them grays. Sometimes that is red. But looking at all this history of all these conflicts, which we call them conflicts, does it seem from Russian perspective as a conflict? Because conflict means we want to resolve it. But Russia does not want to resolve this. Russia wants to keep it as a resource. And as Tina mentioned, the Abkhaz would have died there, but Russia needs those Abkhaz who are angry at Georgians, and this is a great resource. Those Abkhaz remember how they were hurt at some point by Russians. So even if the conflicts and these territories are decided in the favor of Russia, do you think this is what Russia really needs? Because Crimea, maybe was not Crimea a case which was a very disappointing, very boring issue? Would you agree that maybe we should change the language and call that not gray, but something else, a conflict, but something else? Because these seem like great resources for Russia in the way that it stands now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Maria, we'll start with you.
Oh yeah. Oh, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think it deserves a separate conversation about what the West's purposes are with regards to Belarus, right? In some way, it's a choice between two evils, and which one is less evil. Is for the Western countries to decide. It's true that in the past, Lukashenko was trying to essentially to reestablish some kind of relationships with the EU, but the West always demands certain kind of concessions, to which Lukashenko, of course, is not very happy to go. In some sense, the recent decision to move the elections earlier, as I said, right, to divide two elections that are right now scheduled to be held in 2020. This is an attempt partly to demonstrate the more essentially democratic orientation of the leader. But fundamentally, in some sense, for the US, for the EU, this is going to be the case of Saudi Arabia kind of policy. Do we really want to back a dictator in order to one dictator in order to weaken a possibly even worse dictator? Well, I don't think I'm really competent to answer that question. That's something for us to think about.
Okay, coloring in the gray zones. John, you want to tackle that one?
The phrase gray zone is controversial, especially for the countries that are in this region. The concept that we have here is that we want to erase the gray zone. It's what Damon Wilson said at the start of the event. That an area which is in effect in play between, on the one side, the EU and NATO, which represent a certain set of values. On the other hand, a revisionist Russia that represents a wholly different set of values. And we understand that this is a geopolitical problem, and it's very important for us to educate, especially the political class here in the United States, but also in Europe, Western Europe, so they understand this is a problem, and that both Western interests as well as Western values are at stake here. And that we should be doing our utmost to make sure that the countries in this part of the world which want to choose their own destiny, that want democracy, that want an open society, that want to choose their own allies, their own friends, are able to do that. So that what is today a gray zone, and we could search for another phrase to describe it, borderlands has been used before, will become an area where the peoples and the countries choose their own destiny. And that's what we very much like to see.
Okay, Tina, I think the last question goes to you.
Very brief answer. I think that the goal of Moscow is not solution of anything. They need to keep the region destabilized. That's the goal. That's the start and the end of the whole idea. As long as those conflicts, whether frozen or not frozen, are there, it is believed that it holds us back. And there will be always the argument of whether it's EU or NATO against the integration, saying that we cannot take on board the countries with the actual conflicts. So no, I don't believe that any solution is in the interest of Russia or serves interests of Russia. But the destabilization, constant threat coming from those regions, constant belief that it might restart again, like in Nagorno-Karabakh just a couple of years ago, in April 2016. This is exactly how the system works, and this is what serves the Russia's interest. That's why there is no strong move towards any solution in whatever direction, whether in the interest of Russia or interest of Georgia or interest of West or whomever. It just stays as it is because that's the only game Russia is playing.
Thank you. That's the last word. I want to remind the audience we're going to take a lunch break now. Wes Mitchell, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, speaks here at 1:15. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a great conversation.